Hi, I'm Nic Crane. I'm an independent R consultant and open source maintainer. And today I'm going to be talking to you about hacking productivity with LLMs and some experiments I've been doing over the past 18 months. But first, I was thinking recently about a job that I was doing much earlier in my career. I was working on a project, and as part of this project, I had this daily task of extracting a database dump in CSV form, uploading it into Excel, and then messing around with different fields and filters and just getting it just right and sending it on to stakeholders. And the work itself, it was tricky, and it was just like so boring. It was like a really fragile workflow, and if something went wrong, I'd have to start again from the beginning. And it left me at serious risk of a situation known as ILD, imminent laptop defenestration. But instead of ruining my machine and getting fired, I decided to come up with a bit more of a productive approach. I created a Shiny app, and the Shiny app, it connected to the database. Users could apply the filters and things that they needed themselves, and I didn't have to do this boring task every single day. So I was happy. I could focus on more interesting things, and they were happy. They didn't have such a reliance on me at that point. And actually, the thing with creating tools and things to kind of speed things up, there's always that risk that the solution that you come up with and the time that you take putting into it can actually take longer than the actual task would have in the first place itself. And I think, actually, that's something a lot of us are thinking about at the moment in terms of around AI. And so, as Kat Hicks spoke about in her keynote this morning, it's not just what these tools can do, but actually like our experience of interacting with them. And that's something that's really resonated with me. I've spent a lot of time over the last 18 months or so experimenting with LLMs and trying to improve productivity in different ways. Sometimes it's really helped, and other times I've just sank entire afternoons into something that hasn't really worked. So today I'm going to be talking to you about kind of my experience of that and 3 questions that I always reach for now when I'm deciding whether to use an LLM in a task or not. And so the first question then is, how hard should the task be? And I'm going to illustrate this by talking about a R package that I've been working on recently. So the package itself is called Daisy UI Widget. It's a HTML widgets package, and that means it uses a mix of HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and R. And users interact with it primarily in R, well, completely in R. And to work with the package, a user will create a data frame with dates and events. They'll call the function Daisy timeline, and they'll get a timeline just like the one on the right there. So I decided when starting this project to see if I could do it completely from scratch with an LLM. So I opened up GitHub Copilot, put in a prompt, and decided to see what happened. So how did it go? Terribly. Oh my goodness. So I got something that, sure, it was an R package, but when I tried to run the functions, it didn't really work. It felt like the JavaScript and the CSS were just in the wrong place entirely, and it just felt like a complete mess. And actually, because I'd not done any of the reading myself, I didn't even really know where to start to fix it. And I concluded that actually when the task is too hard or too broad, you can start off and generate some code, sure, but when we get to this point of just giving it a quick sense check to see if it makes sense, just everything goes wrong there. So at this point, I had this mess of a package, but luckily I had my friend who was helping me kind of develop it, and so she helped me get it into a better state, and I still wanted to see if LLMs could help. So I decided to try again on a second task. So the kind of AI slop that I got out of GitHub Copilot had come up with this way of working with the package where the function Daisy timeline took a list of lists as its input. But actually, in R with things like this, it's way more typical to actually have a data frame as an input. So all I wanted to do here was change the input from a list of lists to a data frame. Now, it felt like a task I could probably figure out how to do myself. It wouldn't take me too much time, but I just wanted to see what would happen if I got an LLM to do it for me. OK, so how did this one go? Terribly. Oh, my goodness. So I ended up with this weird code that was just a mess of for loops and just things that I've never seen in R before. And it wrote so many tests. For such a small bit of code, I have never seen so many tests written ever before. And it just felt really messy to have to interact with. And also reviewing the code wasn't fun. So yeah, it actually did work, and it did what it was supposed to. But when going through it, there was so much to untangle. Because I feel like code review is like essentially quite a social process. it can be quite fun to collaborate with people. But here I was just left kind of asking, was it the prompt that I used? Was it the particular model that I used? Or was it the data that it was trained on just didn't have enough good R code in it? And sure, I could try to answer those questions, but again, on such a quick task, it just did not seem like a good use of my time. So here I concluded that, like, if the task is too easy, sure, we can generate the code, and it might work when we give it a quick sense check, but actually we get to this stage of trying to give it a thorough review, and things are not good. But still, I didn't want to completely give up on using LLMs on this package. So I had one other task that I wanted to try it with. So it's quite a typical thing in HTML widgets package to have a widget that's generated that has some sort of kind of user reactivity. So if it's embedded in a Shiny app, in this case, we could have somebody clicking on an event in the timeline, and then a value in Shiny updating, so we can perhaps show some text that's relevant to the chosen event. And I wanted to see if I could implement this. So again, I fired up Copilot, I put in a prompt, I told it, do not write me 70 tests this time, to see if it would work. And how did that go? It was a success. Yeah, so actually this worked. At this point, I felt like I knew enough about sort of roughly where the code should go to be able to review this. It put things in the right place. I had to make some tweaks, but it was more preference than right or wrong. And from this, I kind of concluded that, like, when the task is just the right level of difficulty, it means that I'm going to know enough about roughly what it's supposed to look like to be able to review it properly. And so this is a great place to use LLMs in coding. So I can summarize it like this bit like this. So yeah, if the task is too easy, it feels like spend more time really with the reviewing of the code. If the task is too difficult, I can't even review the code. But actually, if it's harder but achievable, that's the sweet spot. And actually, like, when I drew this out like this, it reminded me of a model for kind of like growth and development that I'd seen before. So this idea that you do the most development when you're in your stretch zone, so not in your comfort zone doing things that you can do really easily all the time, and not in the sort of panic or danger zone where anxiety just takes over, but this place that's just beyond that. So the task had got done, but it didn't feel like the most satisfying learning experience. Like, I hadn't really figured out how to implement these selectable events. I just got the code that did it. So at this point, I decided I was going to kind of revert the changes that had just been made, and I was going to see if I could get an LLM to teach me how to do it myself, which leads me to my second question. What role should the LLM play? So at this point, I decided to review some of the literature out there about using LLMs in education. And I found a paper by Dr. Seelan about how ChatGPT can help as an intelligent learning tutor. So in this paper, Dr. Lin walks through this kind of framework for self-directed learning and specific ways in which ChatGPT might be able to help with this. So the first 3 steps in the framework are establishing the learning goals, locating and accessing the relevant resources, and then adopting and executing the learning activities. So I decided to give this a go. So just to go back to the task then, the selectable events task, it really did feel like a perfect stretch zone task to use here, because I've got experience in writing Shiny apps. I've worked with the DT package. So the DT package is another HTML widgets package. It's for displaying tables. And there's a feature in there that when a user clicks on a row in the table, you can access the index of the row in Shiny and update things based on that. So I've worked on this from the outside of a package before. And I know a bit of JavaScript. But at this point, I knew very little about HTML widgets internals and really didn't have any experience of implementing Shiny reactivity in JavaScript. So it seems like a stretch zone task. So step 1, establish learning goals. And I like to think of this in terms of what would I have done if I wasn't getting LLM help with this. So I guess here I would have been like, cool, my goal is to implement selectable events, cool, and moved on with it. But actually, working with ChatGPT, it asked me a number of questions. It asked me exactly what I was trying to achieve, how long I wanted to spend on it, and what past experience I had. And from my answers to the questions, it ended up coming with this really clear and concise goal, and it broke it down into 3 practical steps. So capturing the event in JavaScript, then passing that to Shiny, and then testing it in an app. Now, could I have done this myself? Sure, but was I likely to? Yeah, probably not. So it just left me feeling like I really knew exactly what I was trying to achieve here. So the second step then, locating and accessing resources. So again, like doing this on my own, I probably end up Googling things and have like 50 browser tabs open and end up down a rabbit hole of kind of reading about a slightly different component. But with ChatGPT help, I had a couple of questions. So how do I prefer learning? I said I prefer learning by doing. I like having kind of snippets of code that I can run and see what happens and play with. And it found me really quickly just 2 resources that were perfect for the task at hand. So firstly, the book JavaScript for R, which has a free copy available online. And secondly, a blog post from 2016 by Dina Talley that's all about more or less exactly what I was trying to do. So great. And I guess this had stopped me kind of having to switch between kind of planning and organizing and coding, and I could just focus on reading up and writing some code. So then finally, the third step for this was this idea of adopting and executing learning activities. So there wasn't much back and forth between me and ChatGPT at this point, because we kind of talked a lot about kind of my past experience and things, but it came up with this 3-step process I was going to follow. Firstly, I was going to have a look in the DT package and kind of try to reverse engineer the code in there. So seeing if I could find the code that actually implemented that row selection to learn more about exactly how that worked. Secondly, build a minimal working demo, so in a tiny little Shiny app, just capturing a user event. And then thirdly, add it to the actual package. But it wasn't just like this 3-step process that was useful. Around this, it did things like it gave me time boxes, so I didn't end up spending too long on each step. It also had useful little bits and pieces, so with the bit around reverse engineering DT, it actually gave me a link to the exact place in the package that I needed to find the code to read, which was really helpful, not having to track that down myself. And it just feels like a lot of these things are all about like reducing the level of frustration that we can end up having when we're trying to figure out a new thing. But even better than that, it also suggested ways that I could use ChatGPT to help me with these. So for example, when I was reverse engineering DT, it mentioned, okay, any code you don't understand, paste it in, and we'll go through step by step. And again, that was super useful. When I was building my minimal demo, the first time I ran it, it wasn't quite right, and just being able to paste it straight in and figure out what wasn't working, again, just reduced that frustration. And then when I added the event tracking to the app, we ended up in this situation where it wasn't working, and I was asking why, and the LLM actually asked me, well, what do you think a user should need to click on in this situation? And it really felt like a really great just learning activity and being tutored on something. And so I deemed this definitely a success. There's a write-up on my blog as well with more detail if you're interested. And I feel like, for me, it was just a really enjoyable learning experience because I feel like I'd done the work myself. It wasn't the LLM doing the work for me. It was scaffolding my learning and pointing me in the right direction and figuring out what questions I needed to be asking and what the right answers were, but just not taking over. And I genuinely felt quite empowered as a learner. So equipped with these ideas of the kind of stretch zone projects and using the LLM as a tutor, I decided to take these ideas and apply them to a completely different project. And this brings me to my third and final question. When is a human the better choice? So I'm one of the maintainers of the Arrow-R package, and I decided I wanted to have a go at contributing to PyArrow, the Python Arrow implementation. I decided to work on a task related to magic methods. Now, if you don't know what they are, it doesn't matter too much for this, but it felt like the perfect stretch zone task in that I've got experience of the Arrow-R package, I can write some Python, but I didn't know much about PyArrow and very little about the internals of Python libraries in general. So it kind of felt in the right place. So next, I needed to figure out what role I wanted the LLM to play. So I decided that I was going to write most of the code. In this case, this task for me was about learning, so I needed to do that myself, really. I also wanted to write the test, just so I could be really clear about what the intentions of the code that I was writing. And I was going to get the LLM to help me with any code tweaks. Maybe there's bits of how things are done in Python that I don't really kind of get with package internals. I was going to use it to help me understand errors and to explain any new concepts, like magic methods, which I had no idea what they were at the time. But also, I had some other help from my friend, Alenka, who is a PyArrow maintainer. And she was just going to jump in anywhere I got stuck. OK, so how did it go? Well, actually, I feel like this is almost like a kind of fight between kind of LLMs and human knowledge, almost like a kind of retro video game with different levels. So the first level then, rubber duck. So I think probably a lot of people in this room have experienced of that kind of rubber duck debugging thing where you've got a problem with some code, and in explaining it to an inanimate object, you actually find yourself getting closer to the solution than you were in the first place without even getting an answer back. And I found here, actually, when I was trying to craft a prompt to kind of put into the LLM, half the time, trying to get something specific enough that it wasn't going to come back with nonsense actually helped me figure out a lot of the problem myself, which was great. The second level, the LLM as an assistant. So there were points at which I was trying to build PyArrow, and it's got C++ under it, and I'm not super experienced in C++, and I ended up with various errors in the build logs. And instead of having to troll through and figure out what was the problem and what was happening, having an LLM just help me pinpoint it really quickly was fantastic. So the third level, the LLM as a tutor. So as I mentioned, I had no idea what magic methods were before this. So I got it to come up with a very quick sort of mini tutorial type thing, give me a really quick, simple example of exactly what it was. And it just made me feel way more prepared for the task I was trying to complete. But actually, there was a point at which kind of LLM help didn't really kind of take me any further. So there was a bit where there were two different conventions of how to approach magic methods in Python and just conflicting information there. I could have asked an LLM, but it felt like actually, with that context and the context of PyArrow, this needed human intervention. So I spoke to Alenka, who helped me by just explaining things from her past experience and her knowledge of this. And yeah, I feel like having somebody acting as a mentor on a project is just so important in so many cases. But actually, kind of like beyond this, I got the pull request done, I got it finished, but I wanted to figure out where would be another place I could contribute, what were other tickets that I could take on that would be kind of fun, interesting, and a good learning experience. And I mentioned it to a few other people collaborating on the project, and they started actually tagging me on issues. And again, I think this thing of having somebody acting as a sponsor, helping kind of figure out opportunities to kind of push you further, again, so, so important to have that human kind of side of things there. So actually, it's kind of not about sort of LLM versus human knowledge. It's more about just where to kind of rely on each. And so to kind of go back to the overall kind of question of how can I be more productive using LLMs, I think it's important to keep in mind that I feel like LLMs shine in the stretch zone. So like projects that can just take you a bit further than where you are at the moment. Not all the time, but sometimes actually using LLMs to scaffold the work and not doing it for you can be really valuable. And finally, like not forgetting the importance of human connection, like really thinking about when to rely on people instead. And I think by doing all of these things, we can kind of shift from passive use of tools to like really active learning, and that can help to build long-term skills and productivity. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. We did have one question. Did you make the art for your slides? Because they're so awesome.
Yeah, I got obsessed with Canva the other day. Oh, no, the other ones. Do you know what? I saw Hadley's talk at User, where he'd done a lot of that, and was like, well, that's a good idea to pay homage to. So, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, thank you so much.